understood. People often talk about standing behind a glass. People don't really touch them, people don't really understand what you're going through, so they don't tell people. They don't tell people the pain they're in, they don't tell people the symptoms, they don't tell people about fatigue, they get on with it. And sometimes when they do, and often when we do tell people, people don't match it, they don't hit it right. People either dismissive or don't understand. One of the things that we have to come back to this, but okay. I'm going to come back to this kind of tension system. I've described the hypervigilance system as a threat system. It's also a drive system, right? So it's also very, very helpful in getting us to do things. If we've got a problem, we get on and we get into it. It's great for problem solving. It's the kind of stuff that's created great things in our society. It's an innate part of being a human. We are active and we solve problems in our environment, and it's fantastic that we can do that. It creates society for us. Some of the problems with this is when it goes into overdrive, is that people become very driven. Often, when we talk about the process of adjustment, and people want to go back to where they were before, get back to their old life, they can push themselves into this overdrive of achieving, of getting there, and this constant driving and pushing continues to activate this stress system. And what we find often is a boom or bust, and all or nothing. People really push and push, and it's a survival method. We're just trying to get what we want, to go back to the way things were, to live the life we want to live. But it doesn't work. We activate more, we can activate more flare activity. People then fall off a cliff and they go into bust. And that's when often we see depression, we see excessive fatigue, we see recurrence of pain, spiking, and then people pick themselves up and they get back on and they run and they push and they try to drive and they're trying to push themselves forward to get back to where they were. And I've used a cartoon of Sisyphus because I think it's how people often experience it. They're rolling the rock up the hill, they get to the top, and that rock just rolls right back down again. And they've got to go right back down again and they pick it up and they start pushing up the hill again. And it feels like it's a constant cycle of boom and bust. And to me, it's the people's spirit. It's that they continue to drive to do this. Some more positive things, I think, is people become really sceptical, and I think that's really helpful, particularly dealing with people like me and people in the medical establishment. Because I'm sure you all had 100 stories, 100 ways of treating things, 100 ways of making things better, and people become their own experts. I think that's a great thing, and they become sceptical of coming to medics and people like myself and having the right answer fed to them. And I think it's a good thing. People have amazing self-sufficiency. Some of the stories that I've come across where people are so driven and are often emotionally very isolated, socially isolated, but they're still driving, they can still achieve. It really is to people's credit that they can become so self-sufficient. And I think this kind of idea of living off script, people create their own way forward. Most people do it by trial and error and learning through picking themselves up over the years and the years and the years. But people do. And people do find a way forward. And people do reach a point of acceptance or greater acceptability. I think there's often not an end point to this idea of acceptance of diagnosis or what we call in kind of medical and psychological parlance adjustment. I think people's acceptability of Behçet being part of their life is something that comes and goes, for sure. And I think the idea of acceptance as an end point is probably not fair, because people will struggle and things will come back and will come. like all kinds of loss with healthy people. Okay, we'll look a little bit at the kind of work we do around some of the fatigue issues, but it encapsulates these wider concerns that I think all impact on fatigue. Medical stuff, yeah, the inflammatory process, we've got biologics that can help. They're not the whole answer for most people, but they can help. So we have our team, they get on, they do that, and we work together through that. We have some of the kind of direct threats to people's well-being, finances, housing, advocacy. We've got people who are asylum seekers and refugees, we're trying to help them with those issues as well. We've got Jean, who's our Behçet support worker. I have to say, she's incredible and fantastic, and we're really, her values we can't put a cost on it. She's a really important part of our team. And when I work with people, and when we work with people, there's no point in us trying to do psychological work with fatigue, anxiety management, when someone has been threatened with having no money, being homeless, or being thrown out of the country. It's not appropriate. We have to help people in the real world with physical, material things. Psychological approaches do not replace that. Biological treatments do not replace a sense of security in the world. I think bringing that awareness of social context for people and understanding of actually this is embedded in how you live your life and how the people around you and the world around you sees you and interacts with you. That's something that you can't actually change. The media and the culture and the politics of the country you live in will influence people's ideas of what it's like to be healthy, not healthy, to be male, to be female, to be parent, whatever. These are things that encroach upon us. So I think having an understanding of those things, that they impact on us, is hugely helpful for people because it helps them find ways to understand and cope and find their own way through, find their own way of being a man or woman within the Behçet in our society. And then kind of more psychological stuff that we do. I often, as a kind of backdrop, invite people to engage in essentially ancient practices. We've been using mindfulness meditative practice in health services now for about 40 years. John Kabat-Zinn first used mindfulness meditative practice for chronic pain and cancer in the United States back in the 1970s. It's got a really good evidence base for helping people reduce the symptoms of anxiety, the alert system, the attention system, the hypervigilance. It just helps a little bit to dampen that down a bit, to adjust to that. I think that's a helpful thing. I talked earlier about habits. It's being habitual and learning experience that's got you into the state that you're in terms of being hypervigilant and over-aroused. It takes time and practice and integration of a new habit of something like meditative practice to have an effect. It's a long-term strategy, it's not a short-term strategy. It's a very gentle strategy. It's not one that's drive-related, it's one that's more compassion-related. It's one that's more about relaxation and more about looking after yourself in a different kind of way. And the two forms of therapy we usually do, like compassion-focused therapy and mindfulness, they say they're based on ancient practices, you look at all kind of religious practices, they all have some form of meditative or reflective practice that actually activates the same systems in our brain. So they affect the autonomic nervous system and they reduce the hyperaroused systems. The compassion-focused therapy and mindfulness practice are kind of secular versions of things. So I think if you've got a belief system or you practice anything like this, use it, continue it, incorporate it into part of your life. And then for fatigue particularly, someone talked about the boom and bust and pacing and having power naps or zoning out or little and often. I think that's really important. you will find that you have, because the unpredictability of it, you'll wake up, you'll feel fine, and then you'll be hit by it a few hours later. You make plans to go out, you go out, you're hit by it when you're out, or you're hit by it before you go out, and you can't go out. The little and often strategy is have a rest before you need a rest. In things like secondary fatigue, chronic fatigue, we often recommend things like have 10 minutes for every hour. So every hour you're doing stuff, have 10-15 minutes where you're zoning out and rest time. And when I say zoning out, I mean kind of that sort of daydreaming state that we can go into. That's what I mean. Not necessarily falling asleep, you can fall asleep, it's fine, but more of the daydreaming state, which people might find that in that quite a lot. But it's helpful, it's helpful.
We're in that most of the day.
We're probably quite like that now. Okay, so and I often talk about, because people often, the fatigue then makes people kind of avoid things. They feel bad, they feel guilty about letting their friends down, so they stop going out, stop doing stuff, or they can't do what they want to do, so they just don't do any of it. So I say do a little bit of it, it doesn't matter if it's not that great, do it anyway. If you want to go out for an hour and then come home. Leave on a high, don't stay out for 2-3 hours and feel exhausted and feel rotten and not enjoy it. Because it's about trying to create moments of connection and pleasure with people around you. So it's the opposite from that drive of I must do it, I've got to do this, I've got to be good. Yeah. Okay. And there's a couple of other things we do as well. We've kind of talked about a lot of the stuff already. Cognitive therapy, well, sometimes we do talk to people about what they believe about themselves, particularly if they've held lots of beliefs about themselves for long periods of time, lots of views of themselves. And I think it's helpful to start challenging some of those things about whether you can do things or not, or how you see yourself. And I would do that through individual therapy, or we do that through individual work with someone. You can do attentional refocusing, guided visual imagery. That's quite helpful. It's also helpful for pain. This stuff's also helpful for chronic pain. Do a lot of work around sleep and rest for people. People get frustrated and distressed because they can't sleep at night, but actually being distressed when you can't sleep just doesn't help, it makes it even worse. So trying to get people into, okay, you can't sleep, so what can you do? How can you have at least an enjoyable time, or at least a less stress time when you're not able to sleep? So I often talk to people about kind of having ordinary time and having Behçet time. And Behçet time is different and a more accepting time because you're not able to sleep, that you might be in pain, that you might have fatigue. If people have trauma-related symptoms, we'll do specific trauma work, because trauma, post-traumatic stress, continually activates our danger alert system, and it won't change. These things will help a bit, but actually you need to do reprocessing and memory and processing of traumatic incidents. Grief, loss and acceptance, we think we've talked a lot about that, about living off script or skiing off piste, you use whatever analogy you like, but I think they're empowering sort of analogies. But people do often have to go through the grieving process. They do have to go through the point of becoming quite depressed, quite low, to go through the process of accepting a change in their life, and often very profound changes. And I often get people talking about, does this mean I'm giving up and giving in? And they want to fight it. They go, this is not giving up and giving in. This is fighting it. It's fighting it in a different way. People expect to fight it by using the drive system, by conquering, by overcoming. I'm going to do things. Never saying no to people. Always being the one that does things. But that's not the way to fight this. It's not a helpful way to fight it. It ends up being a cruel way it ends up being a harsh way to treat yourself. The fight happens in the research, the fight happens in the clinics, the fight happens in societies to put money into research, into developing support services and networks, and to developing treatments. That's where the fight happens. The fight doesn't have to happen when you feel that you're obliged to not say no to something, because if you say no to something, it means that you've given in to it. That's not fun. And that can be difficult for people to shift their perspective on it. And then finally, I think it's really important is this idea of social capital, and I think that's what you're doing here today, and that's what the Behçet Syndrome Society does. We set up local support groups, we make get people to network together, people talk, people want to do things, people support each other. I mean, that's what was incredible what you see in certainly the London groups. And that to me is vitally important, that connection where people just understand you, connect to you, can have compassion with you, and you can have the same return. It's incredibly important. I think it's a really, again, another area that just helps us think about how we live our lives with something like Behçet. Okay, I'll put a couple of resources. Again, they're all self-helpy stuff. And I might circulate more stuff if that's okay.
Yeah, please, if you circulate it to me, I'll pass it.
Okay. Thank you all for listening. It's been a real pleasure, and I'm very happy to have discussion. I'm not the founder of all knowledge by a long shot, but I think I've got one or two things to say about one or two things. And I think we all do. So,
because we have a problem with our next speaker who has a very tight schedule. So what I was going to say,
yeah, sure, that's fine.
If we could take, as it were, questions
Yeah.
afterwards.
Yeah, that's fine, no problem.
You'll notice I've cut Richard and my section. That's so you wouldn't fall asleep this afternoon. But no, it's really been too tight a time, so I don't want to keep the last speakers waiting. And again, with Steve, we'll try to include him at the end, or he'll certainly be around for your individual questions. So.
Yeah, if not, then two more questions.
Questions to me, and I can ask them.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Do you want to do our presentation?